Thank you to everyone. So glad to be here. So, a couple of things as we get started. You will notice that there's a bingo card on your chair. I invite you, as you're listening to my presentation, to see how many of these words I use and keep track, bingo, across columns, rows, and the X across that way. I invite you, if you get a bingo, to just yell it out. I will not stop, but this is a performance piece, so please do that. I'm very curious to see how that goes. And yes, these words are from the currently censored government words in the United States. Yes, surprise. Chocolate. And so if you get more than one during the presentation, just keep track because the person has the most will, or the people who get the most will get the prize. So the presentation, it actually covers a lot of ground. And so with Herman's help, I went through and cut what I'm going to show to you a little bit, but you have access to the full research that I've done, as well as a bibliography. If there are parts of this that interest you, just so you know that, also so that you know that you will see this again. So I want your questions for sure, but don't feel any pressure like you can't have access to this. I'm very happy to share any of this with you. I'd like to start with how did I get into this research? So this presentation is about the importance of transdisciplinary scholarship. We've heard a lot about that. To address the complexities of, yes, there's that word, the polycrisis. There's another word, wicked problems that face us. And for me, it's really about examining what challenges there are to changing human, environmental, and social behaviors. The fires of climate change and the censorship of ideas, the banning and burning of books, are stoking new and definitely conjoined fires that really challenge our human ability to make this paradigm shift into a different way of behaving in the world. And of course, I understand there's a lot of assumptions under that. So as I go on, I hope that you will see what some of my assumptions are and will ask me about those. The metaphor of fire is what came up for me. And so I was really looking at fire in terms of censorship and the burning of books, fire in terms of anti-Blackness, and especially James Baldwin's work, The Fire Next Time, and what he says about white supremacy and global race relations. And then fire, and I was thinking of the devastating Los Angeles fires in January. So that was the representation there. And this is, I'm a race theorist, a philosopher of environmental studies, and definitely a very transdisciplinary thinker. And so for me, it was like, how do these things come together? And what is the metaphor of fire saying to me? And what can I share about what I got from that metaphor? A hot mess comes directly from my grandma. She would say that a lot, sometimes describing my behavior, and other times describing the situation of the world. So thank you, Grandma. So the context of this was, my ideas about wicked problems, about the necessity to be transdisciplinary, the importance of systems thinking, the polycrisis, what role do polymaths who are able to hold that transdisciplinarity within themselves take, and the role of metaphors. Wicked problems, I know that you've heard this terminology. It's something that we do use in environmental studies a lot. And a wicked problem is one that's characterized by many of these things: resisting quick fixes, high levels of ambiguity, the kind of you push down on one end and think you've solved, and something else comes up on another end that you didn't really expect. And so wicked problems and polycrisis, these two terms keep coming up, especially in describing environmental and social challenges that we're facing right now. One way that we deal with these wicked problems is through thinking across disciplines and through systems thinking. And so the goal of transdisciplinary research is to respond to this. We need a certain level of knowledge in order to respond to these problems, and that really is the goal. I found a really interesting slide here about the difference between multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, and transdisciplinary, which I know many of you know. But this also, as you can tell, I love pictures. I'm a visual artist. I actually have an art studio and a full practice in Berlin, and recently had an exhibition in February called Woke Work. So I really like banned words. I hope you have woke someplace on your bingo card. And so I liked the artistic representation here of what transdisciplinary was. And Max Neath was one of the people who's written an incredible article on transdisciplinarity back in 2005. Now it says our global and planetary problems are bigger than the sense making of any single world view. And so this collaboration is needed both across disciplines, across our different groups of people, but also more so, and he says this, within ourselves. How do we make our own minds open to this way of thinking? So I think about this idea of who is the polymath. I was one of those people as I was growing up. I knew this, and you would hear, you choose a career, put your ladder up against that, and you climb the ladder of your career. And my immediate thought was, which wall is that ladder supposed to be leaning on? And so I've done many, as you know. And this idea of polycrisis, and I love the critique and I agree with it, but it came out of Davos, so a very conservative way of naming the fact that, and at the time this was reported and it came up, it was COVID-19, the war in Ukraine, all of these things were happening collectively, not to us individually, but collectively at the same time. Um, and not only that they're occurring simultaneously, as Damiani says, but they exacerbate each other in complex and often unexpected ways, so that the whole of the problem is greater than the sum of the parts. But polycrisis is also critiqued from this point of view, mostly by indigenous researchers who say, yeah, duh, right? You're just waking up to the fact that this condition has been normal for societies in the global south and in indigenous communities, and it's nothing new. And that actually this increasing concern for a polycrisis is the inability of the wealthier parts of the world to protect themselves, especially from environmental disasters. So it's actually hiding, if you will, obscuring the operations of power that are the heart of contemporary crisis. And I couldn't resist. I had to keep this slide in. It's not a crisis, it's a scam. Capitalism is the crisis, according to Farwa Sial, who said that we have to keep thinking of the systems themselves and the powers inherent in these systems that have led to this crisis. Um, I want to say here, and again, as an environmental thinker, I had to remind us of the fact that in order to understand these crises, especially in terms of the climate crisis, we have to understand what they're doing in this systems thinking way that we currently operate our society based on that model where the economy seems to be larger than anything else. But there is no economy outside of our society, and there's no society outside of our environment. As one of the groups says, we are part of nature. And so what we're trying to do in terms of changing behavior is really to get us to think in terms of the systems that already exist on this one planet. And those are chemical systems, physical systems, biological systems. And what we're stressing are those actual systems. We have pushed them beyond their capacity to recover. So a polymath, specialist, generalist, again, loves the diagram here by Idris Mora, really captures this idea. And what I like to repeat is there's no better or worse here. Some of us operate in terms of how we think about the world better as a specialist, others better as a generalist, and some of us better as a polymath, if we use that term. I love metaphors as an artist and a writer. Metaphors speak to me and help me make these bridges between different topics. So that's one of the keys for me is the visual and the metaphors. And so that's why I included the metaphor of fire. So when you think about the climate crisis, and these photographs are just stunning. And of course, I was not in Los Angeles at the time. These are not my photographs, but just hearing about it, even though being far away from it was critical. And I did live in Los Angeles and actually knew some of what was going on. As a reminder, starting on the 7th of January this year, in the Los Angeles metropolitan area, there were numerous, especially 3 large fires, and the Santa Ana winds were extremely strong. If you live in Southern California, Santa Ana winds mean something to you. By the 31st of January, these fires had destroyed 18,000 homes, burned 57,000 acres of land, forced evacuation of 200,000 people, and caused at least 30 fatalities. And we know that climate change was partially responsible because of the increased overall temperature, the buildup of vegetation, periods of drought punctuated by heavy rain, and the hurricane force of the Santa Ana winds. And so there were a lot of studies towards the end of the fire and immediately afterwards talking about what is the relationship between these fires and climate change. And even Wikipedia got there and said that the Institute Pierre Simon Laplace did a study attributing the intensified conditions to anthropogenic climate change. Censorship. Now, you said a lot more about censorship even than I could talk about in this brief period of time. I found this fascinating. I really looked at that list when somebody sent it to me, coming from PEN America, that you're seeing in the bingo game, and thought, wow, this is really an attack on free speech, an attack on racial and environmental justice. There's a relationship of this level of censorship right now in the United States between historical suppression of literacy, especially in the African American community, and this whole idea of silencing critiques and silencing critics. So PEN America published this list just very recently. And their list, there are a couple of lists going around, but PEN America's had 250 words. The original restriction was to words concerned with diversity, equity, and inclusion, but it quickly increased to include a range: vaccine, climate change, cultural heritage, ethnicity, ideology, multicultural, Native American, some of the old bingo, tribal, underprivileged, and even women. And so the intent really, as a colleague of mine, Dina Metzger, says, is to neutralize the language as a way of eliminating opportunities to undermine or challenge the bullying mind in power. I love that phrase, which is committed to white supremacy, privilege, money, and power consolidated in the hands of a few. They create a field of awareness. If you look at these words, this list of words, and what they actually guide us to, which is the opposite, a sense of ethical behavior and a future for all of us. Dina says, my first response to this list, to the fact of such a list, was to say that we should say and write these words as often as possible, find ways to honor them. And so that's what I've done today, is to honor them with this bingo game. Find out, what do these words actually mean? Historically, there's a lot of information on book burnings, and if you get the bibliography from me, you will see some of the references there. They have traditionally been used to stymie social change. and to prevent the dissemination of some greater ideas. A famous book, Fahrenheit 451, of course, Ray Bradbury. And the temperature, the title of the book is The Temperature at Which Paper Ignites and Burns. And I love that. And it is indeed a story, for those of you who don't know it, about the main character, the protagonist, is a fireman whose responsibility it is to burn books. And is that happening now? So I really went and looked. Yes, it is. One particular author had a group of college students, and this was in 2019, burned her book when she came to talk to them at college. A Tennessee pastor led a burning of some Harry Potter and Twilight novels. So I'm going to move forward to this. Books that touched on race were among the most challenged as inappropriate for libraries in 2020. And then I'm going to skip forward to James Baldwin because these are some of the books, but I want to make sure that we get to the suppression of literacy and its racial aspect. A reminder, in the United States, laws were passed to ensure that enslaved African Americans did not learn to read, and that was a punishable event. And Frederick Douglass, in his book, talks about learning to read and write as a child. So this is not a small issue in the African American community. And so let's move forward. James Baldwin, The Fire Next Time. James Baldwin writes very, very eloquently about this time and remembering his time, looking at those dates. He was born into the height of the suppression of African American society in terms of lynchings and in terms of civil rights and in terms of Jim Crow and segregation. And so when he wrote in his book, this is where the title comes from, if we do not now dare everything, the fulfillment of that prophecy recreated from the Bible in song by a slave is upon us. God gave Noah the rainbow sign, no more water, fire next time. It's taken from a spiritual, it does not call for violence, but it calls for a reckoning, a demand for justice. And it comes from these events in African American history where there was just so much hatred directed towards this community. What I really want to skip to, because it talks about empathy here, is also a quote from Baldwin. If the concept of God has any validity, and he has a very problematic relationship with religion and with God, which he writes about, but he says it is only to make us larger, freer, and more loving. If God cannot do this, it's time we get rid of him. And so I really had to think about, and this is the last thing that I'll say, in my research, reading about Baldwin, was who other of our scholars talks about love. And so, sorry, back. Certainly Nelson Mandela spoke about love and that no one was born hating each other. In this one, Jimi Hendrix also talks about love, which I love that. Bell Hooks, famously a race scholar that writes about love, and Martin Luther King, as we all know. So I think I'm going to come close to ending with that thought that a response to censorship and a response to injustice should be love is something that I left thinking very deeply about. And what does that mean? And how do we do that? How do we respond to the times that we're in now with that level of empathy towards the people who, in fact, might be the ones perpetrating these injustices against us? Jasmine Ward also wrote a book. I'm happy to talk about that if you'd like, but I think my time is up, right? I have 2 minutes. Okay. Then I will read what Jasmine Ward wrote because she was inspired by Baldwin's work. And she was writing this now at a time of the Trayvon Martin murder and Eric Garner and others. And she said, I hope that we, new Black voices, are writing an epic wherein Black lives carry worse, wherein Black boys can walk to the store and buy candy without thinking they will die, wherein Black girls can have a bad day and be mouthy without being physically assaulted by a police officer, wherein cops can see 12-year-old Black boys with fake guns as silly kids and not homicidal maniacs, wherein Black women can stop to ask for directions without being shot in the face by paranoid white homeowners. I burn and I hope. So I will end with those words.